Lishana Tova. Um, Welcome virtually to Beth Israel Congregation, the home for Jewish life in Waterville, Maine since 1902. A few words for Erev Rosh HaShanah. Does it ever get any easier? I remember sitting in a mentor's office when I was in my early 20s, totally exhausted and anxious about the hard work of growing up into an adult. Ill at ease not only about my own development, but waking up to a world still reeling from September 11th, embarking on two new Middle Eastern wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and an Israel smack in the middle of a second intifada. At the time, it seemed like the world couldn't get any worse. And then, in one of the only times I can remember this particular professor looking into my eyes with her characteristic stridency and compassion, she told me a partial lie. Yeah, Rachel, I think it does. It does get easier as you get older. Now, in fairness, this was the early 2000s, and while a lot of the seeds of our current national and global dysfunction had begun to sprout at that time, they hadn't bloomed into the full-on craziness we currently live in at this moment. So maybe this wisdom was partially true at the time, but it wasn't the complete truth. Life doesn't always get easier. Sometimes it gets much harder. I think of that conversation often. Isn't life supposed to get easier with time? With greater wisdom, deeper spiritual reserves, the benefit of experience, and stronger emotional armor. Shouldn't it be easier to live and lead than it was 10 or 20 years ago? Look, in some respects, life does get a little easier. As you experience more ups and downs in the course of a normal human life, it does get somewhat easier to take everything in stride. Not every personal failure is an unredeemable catastrophe, and not every win, you don't expect it to be a paradigm shift that will lead to a lifetime of smooth sailing. And on the other hand, the failures and frustrations add up, and they begin to live in your body. You carry them cumulatively, unwelcome guests living in tight knots in your muscles, reminders that kinds of risks carry consequences that you probably don't want to endure at a later stage of life. Most of us, short of a near-death experience or a midlife crisis, most of us become more fearful over time, not less. In some ways, as we do the work of being human, life gets easier, and in other respects, it gets harder. Although I will say, at least in 2021 America, most of us are feeling that the going is pretty rough. And many of us are questioning, do I have what it takes to thrive, maybe even to survive, in this increasingly crazy, angry, and unforgiving world? Rabbis across the country in the month of August, we were all asking one another, how do we give our congregants hope right now? Especially because I gave the hope sermon last year, and I really kind of believed it at the time last year, but now I'm not sure I can give that hope sermon with a straight face. It is a tough question we have all been facing, a quandary made all the more bitter, since it seemed like we were really out of the woods with this pandemic, and now it appears not so much. Add to that political polarization, climate change, Afghanistan, cancel culture, and all the rest of it. How does a spiritual leader who doesn't double as a snake oil saleswoman say, it's actually not that bad, and I'm certain that it will get better? I don't think we can tell those lies. But I do think there is a wisdom in our tradition, a tradition that has grown in the midst of and in reaction to deep and great catastrophes, and that we can draw great wisdom from that tradition. We can't always be totally hopeful, but we can find the strength and dignity in muddling through. Not forever, but for now, when ultimate redemption and unadulterated, intellectually honest comfort might not be on the menu for a while. Finding the strength and dignity in muddling through might be called resilience in today's parlance. But whatever you call it, we need it now more than ever. Gita Aryan Beck, in her book The Inheritors, writes this about resilience. Resilience is the process of creating meaning out of the contradictions of life's darkness and light. It builds on the strength of relationships and community. It is the affirmation of life and our own power. It leads to growth, compassion, and positivity. Resilience is the ability to make meaning out of the light and dark of our lives through healthy relationships and strong communities. It is the ability to affirm the value of our lives and the potency of our power, even during our personal and communal lows. This kind of resilience allows us to stretch, grow, and find the place to be kind, patient, and positive with ourselves and with others. My teacher from the Jewish Theological Seminary, Rabbi Michal Springer, connects this definition to the Jewish ceremony of Havdalah, a ceremony that finds meaning in the light and the darkness, and the blessings that we say from awakening the senses after much needed rest. After we light the Havdalah candle, but before we say our brachot, we recite the line from Isaiah 12:3. Hine el Yeshuati eftach velo efchad, ki ozi v'zimrat yav vayhi Yeshua. Indeed, God is my deliverance. I am confident and shall not fear, for God is my strength and song and has been a help to me. As we mark the space that celebrates both light and darkness through Havdalah, why do we speak about God's redeeming power, banishing fear, and affirming the existence of God's helping hand? Because we need something to hold on to during the extremes of our lives. And it is from that state of relative stability that we can create meaning and draw power. Unlike the Zoroastrians, the theological foils of the rabbis in the Babylonian Talmud, we don't believe as Jews in a good God that makes light and goodness, and a bad God that is responsible for darkness and pain. Rather, affirming the words of Isaiah, we affirm in our liturgy that God is Yotzer Or Uvorei Choshech, Oseh Shalom Uvorei Et Hara. God is the creator of light and darkness, peace and evil. All of the phenomena in our lives are ultimately connected to God's creative powers. We come from a tradition that forces us, through our liturgy, to affirm the complexity of attributing to a single source both our joy and our pain, the good and the bad, the luminescent and the dull. Our job as Jews is to create meaning, purpose, and a sense of self through it all, in the context of a pliable, strong, supportive community. When we have the confidence, social connections, language, and emotional wherewithal to create meaning in the space between stimulus and reaction, that is when we have the space to survive and ultimately to stretch and grow. The stories we weave, that we tell ourselves about the meaning of our lives in this moment, need not be simple or even completely coherent. They shouldn't be. Because if they are, those flat, flimsy, brittle narratives will crack under pressure and scrutiny. Our lives are rarely coherent, and little about the world at this moment is. We engage in Havdalah, differentiating between light and darkness, precisely because most of our lives exist in the in-between, incoherent, inchoate, in the mixtures between light and dark. We need ritual to impose human-driven order on a chaotic, mixed-up world, to create moments of absolutes in a world that by its very nature actually provides us with very few clear-cut binaries. The story of our lives is much less like the opening chapters of Genesis that tell us about the creation of the world through opposed absolutes, and much more like the oscillating life of our very human ancestor Joseph, whose life took him from the pit to the palace to the prison and all back there and then back again. Most of our time is spent in the lift and fall of our fortunes, attributed most honestly to an imprecise alchemy of God's hand, our agency, luck, and the actions of others. Joseph's triumph was not found in his fortunes, but rather through the story he told himself and his brothers about the meaning of his topsy-turvy life. To his brothers who sold him into slavery, he said, "Do not be angry at yourselves. I know now that this journey is what God intended for me." Did Joseph know this empirically to be so? Probably not. There was no external, objective verification of his claim that his pain and trials were the will of a loving and just God. However, he chose to tell a story about his deepest pain and his subsequent glory in order to allow his brothers to retain their dignity and for him to forgive them enough to feel the comfort of being reunited. Resilience is the process of creating meaning out of the contradictions of life's darkness and light. Joseph chose to make meaning out of the contradictions and extremes of his life, both the darkness of the pit in prison and the blinding light of near absolute power and privilege in the palace. In all of these places, the light and the dark, the pain and the pleasure, we have a choice to tell a story that makes us and our world better, or not. In his famous book, The Body Keeps Score, Basil van der Kolk contends that a core element of resilience is agency, knowing that what we can do can make a difference. We need to believe that what we do matters and that it can make the world a better place. In a world encountering such profound suffering locally, nationally, and globally, in order to muddle through, to survive, and maybe even to thrive in this moment, we need to believe. We need to tell ourselves a story, a believable story, that we can have a positive impact. We cannot give way to despair or nihilism. As Rabbi Springer said so powerfully to her Talmidim, her students, who are now rabbis out in the field this past August, she said, "We cannot afford to undervalue ourselves." These words came out of her profound and excruciating and holy work that she does now as a hospital chaplain in Manhattan. She spoke movingly about her work that she has taken on in the past 2 years, serving in this role during the pandemic. Her job as a rabbi is to see people and offer comfort in their pain and terror, along with teams of overworked nurses, doctors, and other medical professionals. She told a story that one day she encountered a nurse who would walk from one dying patient to the next, giving her all to each human being during the most transcendent, lonely, and horrifying moments of their lives. And after each encounter, she would turn to Rabbi Michal and say, "I gave them all I had, and that's all I had to give." Whatever this nurse gave to her patients meant something. In order to come back to work each and every day, she needed to say to herself and her rabbinic witness, "I gave that person all I had, and in being there, it mattered." One need not be an overburdened nurse in a COVID ward to weave a life of impact and meaning. In fact, in order to muddle through, the moments of repose, introspection, peace, and joy are just as critical as the made-for-TV movie moments of extreme service. In her famous poem, The Summer Day, Mary Oliver describes one of those moments that should be resonant to most of us who make our lives home in Maine. Who made the world? Who made the swan and the black bear? Who made the grasshopper? This grasshopper, I mean the one who has flung herself out of the grass, the one who is eating sugar out of my hand, who is moving her jaws back and forth instead of up and down, who is gazing around with her enormous and complicated eyes. Now she lifts her pale forearms and thoroughly washes her face. Now she snaps her wings open and floats away. I don't know exactly what a prayer is. I do know how to pay attention, how to fall down into the grass, how to kneel in the grass, how to be idle and blessed, how to stroll through the fields, which is what I have been doing all day. Tell me, what else should I have done? Doesn't everything die at last and too soon? Tell me, what is it you plan to do with your one wild and precious life? Oliver starts with a question: who made the world? And our tradition gives us an answer: God. However, answering broad theological questions with certainty does not bring most of us comfort, because intellectual assertions do not give us real peace, real purpose, and the kind of grounding that gives us the strength to face the toughest challenges. What is really necessary is to let that deep truth penetrate our hearts enough to be filled with awe and gratitude. Our challenge in finding resilience is to be still and observant enough to take in the beauty of this world and see it as a profound and miraculous blessing. Jewish law requires us to say 100 blessings a day. At first, this requirement can feel like a burden, but then you realize that this law is there to force us to do the most important and difficult thing a human being can and must do: appreciate. How to be, as Oliver describes for us, to be idle and blessed. Or, if 100 is too many, we can borrow words from another religious tradition. In the words of the Sufi poet Rumi, if you only say one prayer in a day, make it thank you. In muddling through this life with a certain amount of grace, you need a good, flexible story that allows you to retain your dignity and hope through the darkness and the light. You need gratitude. You also need rest. From a biblical perspective, Sabbath rest is both an inalienable right to be affirmed both in human beings and animals, and a rigid commandment. God models the necessity for rest on the seventh day, and the Bible is actually ambiguous about whether God simply rested on the seventh day or created rest on Shabbat. In his famous book, The Sabbath, Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel describes the contours of that debate and a midrash that he believes resolves it. Quote, on the seventh day, God finished God's work, Genesis 2:2. Seems to be a puzzle. Is it not said God rested on the seventh day? In 6 days, the Lord made heaven and earth, Exodus 20:11. We would surely expect the Bible to tell us that on the sixth day, God finished God's work. Obviously, the ancient rabbis concluded there was an act of creation on the seventh day. Just as heaven and earth were created in 6 days, Menucha, rest, was created on Shabbat. After the 6 days of creation, what did the universe still lack? Menucha, rest. Came the Sabbath, and came Menucha, and the universe was complete. That's Rashi's take on it, Genesis 2:2. Menucha, which we usually render with rest, means here much more than a withdrawal from labor and exertion, more than freedom from toil, strain, or activity of any kind. Menucha is not a negative concept, but something real and intrinsically positive. This must have been the view of the ancient rabbis if they believed that it took a special act of creation to bring it into being, that the universe would be incomplete without it. What was created on the seventh day? What did God create on Shabbat? Tranquility, serenity, peace, and repose. Genesis Rabbah 10:9, end quote. Achad Ha'am famously wrote that more than the Jewish people have kept Shabbat, Shabbat has kept the Jewish people. How else could we have collectively survived the toil and oppression we endured for thousands of years, and continue to endure, without regularly affirming our own inherent dignity and worth through resting and actively, intentionally relishing our lives through feasting, song, study, and traditionally, a good scotch. God made Menucha on the seventh day, and it has been the Jewish people's secret sauce for surviving millennia of catastrophe, mostly intact. But here is the most beautiful and difficult piece of it all. Even with rest, gratitude, and a great story, you can't do it alone. Individual Jews have come and gone, both from this world and from amidst our people. But our survival has been collective. And that is because in lightness and darkness, in fat and lean years, this life is too much to bear without witness and a human embrace. We learn in Proverbs, Da'aga b'lev ish yashchena, v'davar tov yisamchena. If there is anxiety in a man's mind, let him bring it low and turn it into joy with a good word. How do we bring our anxiety low and turn it into joy with a good word? We learned in the Babylonian Talmud 75a, Ami and Rav Asi explained the phrase bring it low differently. One said one should suppress the anxiety. The other said one should tell it to others. Engaging in Hebrew wordplay, Rav Asi connects the similar sounding simcha, joy, to sicha, conversation. We conquer our anxieties and transform them into opportunities for joy by sharing our pain. Not to bring that person low along with us, but to serve as a witness that we have done all we could with what we had. And then work with us in finding a way to find meaning and release in the lives we are required at times to simply endure. And at other times, we can make into something of sublime and deeply loved beauty. There is no harder work in this world than muddling through. If we are open, observant, rested, and spiritually prepared, we can have one of Mary Oliver's transcendent grasshopper moments. Or even more profoundly, we can achieve the feeling of overwhelming calm and resonance that can bring you to tears at the edge of a Negev desert or a Sugarloaf mountain hike, where the beauty of the world is simply too great to attribute to chance alone, and makes you feel simultaneously so small and yet so held by your Creator. But even in the best of times, those moments are fleeting. They pass quickly. Muddling through with real resilience requires a reworking of one's life and most basic priorities, habits undertaken personally and communally that make this life endurable and on a few occasions joyful. A story that dignifies yourself and others through the pits and the palaces. True and profound gratitude for what you have been given and what you have earned. Taking regular time for rest and reflection with good food, a lot of good food, good song, good drink, and good friends. And lastly, a community that can bear true witness to who you are and what you have done with this one wild and precious life. None of these things come in a pill or a vape pen, and they can't be purchased through cash, check, or money order for 5 easy payments of $19.99. But they can be learned and held in a Jewish community, a community we all need to work hard for and within to find what we need. A community that at least most of the time needs to find ways to come together in person, even if it requires bundling up in masks and schlepping chairs onto our patio, that requires showing love and care for people who wouldn't necessarily be our friends in other contexts. A community that affirms for us that we are the inheritors of one of the most resilient stories of survival ever lived. The off-tune liturgy that connects us with one another and our ancestors, the blessed opportunity and obligation to sit still for a few hours every week, and that sees us in the full complexity of who we are and who we hope to become. We are living during interesting times, and I don't have any personally generated wisdom that will change your life. But I do have a tradition that has taught me how to muddle through when life is painful, unfair, confusing, and even sometimes too beautiful to manage on my own. And in honor of that inherited tradition, I continue to utter, sometimes easily, and sometimes with gritted teeth, the one and most crucial prayer. Thank you. Whatever comes this way, may we all find the grounding and perspective to say this prayer daily and truly mean it. L'Shana Tova U'Metuka, a good, sweet, and livable year to us all.